The bomb. Soon after Japan's surrender, Robert Oppenheimer got on a train and headed east. He was a nervous wreck, a fellow passenger observed. Oppenheimer kept looking under the table and all around. Everyone knew Oppenheimer now. His name was spread across newspaper headlines. His bony face and intense eyes stared out from magazine covers. The press was calling him father of the atomic bomb, a new kind of superhero. Superman relied on his enormous physical strength. Oppenheimer could let loose the energy locked inside atoms. Oppenheimer was torn by the attention. He relished the fame but was terrified by the thought of what he had helped create, a world with atomic weapons. If you ask, can we make them more terrible? The answer is yes. Oppenheimer told a reporter. If you ask, can we make a lot of them? The answer is yes. This is what he was hoping to prevent. Oppenheimer got off the train in Washington, D.C., carrying a report with his recommendations for the future. Physicists could certainly design more powerful atomic bombs, he argued, but would that necessarily make the country safer? No, because other countries could also build bombs, and there would be no way to ensure that those bombs weren't used on Americans. The safety of this nation, he insisted, cannot lie wholly or even primarily in its scientific or technical powers. It can be based only on making future wars impossible. The only hope, he believed, was for the United States to stop building bombs and to somehow convince the Soviet Union not to start. Truman's Secretary of State, James Barnes, replied that neither goal was realistic. Barnes returned Oppenheimer's report with a message for its author. Tell Dr. Oppenheimer, for the time being, his proposal about an international agreement is not practical, and that he and the rest of the gang should pursue their work full force. In other words, he wanted Oppenheimer to get back to the lab and build more bombs. That's what Leslie Grove expected too. If things moved according to schedule, he reported, the U.S. Army would have 20 plutonium bombs by the end of 1945. Oppenheimer returned to Los Alamos feeling what he described to a friend as a profound grief and a profound perplexity about the course we should be following. At the lab, Edward Teller showed him a design for a far more powerful atomic weapon. He wanted Oppenheimer to help get government support for the new bomb. I neither can nor will do so, Oppenheimer told Teller. It was obvious, Teller said later, that Oppenheimer did not want to support further weapons work in any way. That was a common feeling among bomb makers. We all felt that, like the soldiers, we had done our duty, said Hans Bethe, and that we deserved to return to the type of work that we had chosen as our life's career, the pursuit of pure science and teaching. On October 16, 1945, Oppenheimer officially resigned as director of Los Alamos. A ceremony was planned, and Dorothy McKibben drove from her office in Santa Fe up to the hill to attend. It was a sunny fall day. McKibben saw thousands gathering in front of an outdoor stage. Beside the stage, she saw Oppenheimer pacing. Hello, she said. He walked right by her. His eyes were glazed over, she remembered, the way they were when he was in a deep thought. On stage a few minutes later, Leslie Groves handed Oppenheimer a scroll, a certificate of thanks from the government to Oppenheimer and the Los Alamos staff. It is our hope that in years to come we may look at this scroll and all that it signifies with pride, Oppenheimer told the crowd. Today that pride must be tempered with profound concern, he continued. If atomic bombs are to be added as new weapons to the arsenals of a warring world or to the arsenals of nations preparing for war, then the time will come when mankind will curse the names of Los Alamos and Hiroshima. The peoples of this world must must unite or they will perish. A week later, Oppenheimer was back in Washington to continue his talks with top officials. Early on the morning of October 24th, he walked the streets of the Capitol with Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Commerce. I never saw a man in such an extremely nervous state as Oppenheimer, Wallace wrote in his diary that night. He seemed to feel that the destruction of the entire human race was imminent. Oppenheimer complained that the Secretary of State Burns didn't seem to understand the implications of the bomb. Burns seemed to think that it could be used like a pistol to scare the Soviets into behaving in a certain way. Oppenheimer believes that this method will not work, wrote Wallace. He says the Russians are a proud people and have good physicists and abundant resources. They may have to lower their standard of living to do it, but they will put everything they have got into getting plenty of atomic bombs as soon as possible. At that point, the United States and the Soviet Union would be in an arms race, each trying to produce weapons fast enough to stay ahead. Oppenheimer believed this race could still be prevented. Do you think it would do any good to see the president? Oppenheimer asked. Yes, said Wallace. The next morning at 10:30, Oppenheimer walked into the Oval Office. President Truman was at his desk. He stood and shook Oppenheimer's hand. This was their first meeting. They sat and began to talk. The conversation started awkwardly. Truman wanted to discuss how scientists and the military could continue working together to make more atomic bombs, while Oppenheimer tried to steer the conversation up to the topic of international cooperation and the goal of stopping the arms race before it could begin. Truman brushed this worry aside, asking, "When will the Russians be able to build the bomb?" "I don't know," Oppenheimer answered. "I know. When?" "Never." Oppenheimer was stunned by Truman's confidence. Unjustified confidence, Oppenheimer believed. He had planned to lay out his step by step strategy for preventing an arms race, backing each step with clearly reasoned arguments. But at this critical moment, he was too emotional to command his powers of persuasion. He lifted his trembling hands in front of Truman. "Mr. President," he said, "I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman's eyes flashed disgust. "Never mind," he mumbled. "It'll all come out in the wash." If Truman had any misgivings about using the atomic bomb, he kept them well buried. A long silence followed. Then the president stood. The meeting was over. "Don't worry," Truman told Oppenheimer as they shook hands. "We're going to work something out, and you're going to help us." Oppenheimer left the room. "Blood on his hands, damn it," Truman grumbled as the door shut. "He hasn't half as much blood on his hands as I have. You just don't go around belly aching about it." When aides came in to discuss other business, Truman snapped, "I don't want to see that son of a gun in this office ever again." Outside the Oval Office, Oppenheimer put on his hat and coat. He walked through the halls and out of the White House and toward the street. He was the father of the atomic bomb, but at that moment he knew his creation was completely and forever beyond his control.